Adina Scott made a phone call from 17,200 feet on an Alaskan mountain formerly known as Mount McKinley. The date was June 24th, 2013. Now, what was especially exciting about this project was for the very first time, a group of climbers making their way to the highest physical point in North America, a mountain that is now and forever will be known as Denali. The team was especially excited to find themselves at this location because they didn't really know that they would be able to get this far. If they were successful, they would be the very first team of African-American climbers to make it to the summit of Denali. Put together by the National Outdoor Leadership School, this group of climbers, 9 in total, 6 men, 3 women, brought together to encourage people in their communities to recognize the importance of outdoor recreation and environmental conservation. Ranging in age between 18 and 56, it was their goal to change the face of what outdoor recreation looks like. And what's especially compelling about their story is that they had an interest in coming back to their communities and sharing that story to perhaps share an idea that I think is worth spreading. That despite low levels of participation in outdoor recreation and environmental conservation, minorities in this country have a vital role to play in the preservation of wilderness, but also those areas that are designated as our national parks. So if you're wondering where I was during all this, this is actually a photograph taken from the lodge of the deck of the Denali Lodge. From our location, we were actually able to monitor the team as they were on their way up there. I want you to understand that the national parks isn't my idea. In fact, it is an idea that was created by naturalists of the 19th century, people like John Muir. And with the backing of President Theodore Roosevelt, John Muir and the Roosevelt administration set aside tracts of land for the exclusive use for recreation for generations to come. Areas that have been designated like Yosemite, Sequoia, Yellowstone, and a variety of different national parks throughout our country. In fact, it was the novelist and naturalist Wallace Stegner who once said, "The national parks are the best idea we ever had. Absolutely democratic, absolutely American. They reflect us at our best instead of our worst." But the national parks, America's best idea, is actually at risk of going away forever. If you take a look at the changing demographics of the people who spend time in our national parks, African Americans, Latinos, Asian Americans, and even Native Americans spend less time in national parks relative to their white counterparts. And if you think about the changing demographic of the United States of America, what America is coming to look like, can you imagine what will happen if the constituency that is coming into the positions of power, positions of authority, to ultimately cast legislation and to define social policy, if that generation is allowed to have no relationship to the natural world, what do you suppose will happen? So I have an idea that's worth spreading, that we can take this new emerging population of millennials, African Americans and Hispanics primarily, and teach them the lessons of environmental conservation and the national parks, and so that future generations will fight to protect them for years to come. Now, Denali has been climbed over the last 100 years by thousands of climbers across the spectrum of America. When it was first climbed on June 7th, 1913 by a native Alaskan by the name of Walter Harper. It was the highest physical point that anyone could reach in the United States, named after a native Athabascan word meaning the high one. It is the one place in all of America where you have to aspire to reach and ultimately find your place there. And when we look forward to seeing what it ultimately means to climb a mountain like this, we put into perspective everything that is most important and most inspiring about being in America. It's a metaphor of what it means to aspire to anything that's difficult, any of the hard challenges, anything that is currently in your life that is making you challenged, mountaineering is the best metaphor. Think about all the songs that you've heard, all the music, and all of the literature that you've read. Mountains and the aspiration of high places is always the most aspiring goal. In fact, and frankly, it could definitely be said that to reach these high summits is to represent what is absolutely best in America. And if we look and think about what it means to be an aspiring climber, we also have to think about what it means to be an American citizen. In 1964, a Boeing engineer by the name of Charles Madison Crenshaw was the very first African American to summit Denali. A member of the Seattle Mountaineers expedition of that year, he was the very first invited to become a member of this expedition. Profiled in Ebony Magazine as a weekend climber, he was recognized in his community as a leader in the mountaineering community. And in the exact same issue that featured him as a weekend climber, there was also a very important cover story in that issue that represented the importance of what it means to be a person of color in this country. And that is the March on Washington. And Martin Luther King Jr., in the very last paragraph of the I Have a Dream speech, has allusions to climbing mountains. From every mountainside, let freedom ring. And if America is to be a great nation, this must be true. So let freedom ring from the heightening Alleghanies of Pennsylvania. Let freedom ring from the mighty mountains of New York. Let freedom ring from the curvaceous slopes of California. Let freedom ring from the snow-capped Rockies of Colorado. From every mountainside, let freedom ring. Now, I think it's fair to suggest that Dr. King was actually talking metaphorically. In fact, at the time, people of color in this country didn't have the ability to travel very freely at all. In fact, if you're a person of color, it's very unlikely that you could walk or experience time in nature with any degree of safety, because frankly, racially motivated violence was a very real possibility. And to be honest, when you're talking about what it means to spend time in nature, it's typically in these wild and scenic places that had indeed been designated and are, frankly, our rights as individuals that many people of color in this country were denied. In fact, people of my parents' generation weren't able to dream of aspiring to mountains to climb. They were actually working on, frankly, more important things, like where they were going to live, where they're going to work, whether or not they could marry outside of their race. And ultimately, it is these generations that unfortunately now spend very little time in our national parks. So when we think about what it means to aspire to spending time in nature, it's very unlikely that Dr. King was really talking literally about spending time outdoors. Or maybe he was. The gentleman on the right is my father. Through the course of his career as the first African American to graduate from UCLA Law School in 1952, he was an active and avid supporter of civil rights in our home in Los Angeles, California. And my dad, along with my mom, fought tirelessly to provide for their family, 5 kids in all, I'm the youngest, to aspire to seek out and find dreams wherever they happen to be, no matter how futile or even frivolous. As a child, I was actually encouraged to spend time in the outdoors. And many of my experiences in nature allowed me to enjoy the privilege and prestige of someone who had doting parents that allowed him to spend time in these wilderness areas that he loved so much. But more than anything else, they impressed upon me the obligation to take my privilege of education, of history, of heritage, of legacy, and share that with future generations and ultimately help to make the world a better place. But it was in the natural world, in the outdoors, in the national parks, that I aspired to find my calling, and that ultimately led me to a career as a journalist. And is now my privilege, in fact, my obligation to tell the story of our history and our heritage. In 1903, Teddy Roosevelt, under the wise counsel of John Muir, decided that it was important that we protect and preserve our wild and scenic places, specifically in Yosemite and Sequoia National Park. In that year, he dispatched units of the U.S. cavalry to protect the national parks. But little did I know, after having spent my entire life as a person who spent time in the outdoors, that in 1903, over 400 of the soldiers that were sent to Yosemite and Sequoia National Park were African American, members of the famed Buffalo Soldiers. These are the men who fought and served with distinction in wars overseas, but during a peacetime deployment, they worked to protect and preserve the national parks. Led by Charles Young, the third African-American graduate of West Point and the first superintendent of Sequoia National Park. He created and established the standard of behavior and decorum that is currently used to create what ultimately became the National Park Service, which next year will celebrate its 100th anniversary. But ironically, when a century ago there were hundreds of African Americans serving with distinction in Sequoia and Yosemite National Park, today there's only one. My friend Shelton Johnson is the only permanently stationed African American park ranger in Yosemite National Park. Now, because he is a writer and a poet, he makes it his business to tell the story of the Buffalo Soldiers and share with everyone he can find, including the President of the United States, why it is important that we carry on this legacy for future generations. And when you visit the park, he will greet you with courtesy and distinction, many of the same ways that the Buffalo Soldiers did during their time in Yosemite. And it's very important for him, and by extension myself, to share this same story with people as they're coming into the parks, to let them know that they do indeed have a place there, that they do indeed have a role there. But if you think about it, and Shelton has told me this, spending time in nature is perhaps the last act of the civil rights struggle. Think about it. This is your heritage, this is your legacy, this is the thing that you are deprived only if you deny it to yourself. Spending time in nature is actually not only our obligation, but it's our privilege. And it's critically important that we inspire young people wherever we can find them to not only spend time in nature, but to excel at it, to spend time in these areas so that when it comes time for them to enact legislation, to allocate federal funds, to create a situation where you can have funding and everything that it takes to keep our parks safe and functioning, they will be inclined to do it. And if you don't think that it won't happen, all you've got to do is take a look at what's happening right here in Wisconsin. Next year, there is zero funding allocated for state park preservation. And as Wisconsin goes, so does much of the United States. So it's very important that we inspire this generation, but if we don't, it's entirely possible that we'll find ourselves in a situation where these young people will aspire primarily to the urban priorities of extraction of natural resources, of consumption of natural resources, and not their preservation. So that it's important for me as a journalist to continue to tell these stories in as loud and as aggressive and as enthusiastic a way as I can possibly imagine, so that we tell these stories and hopefully inspire a new generation to follow in this example. 2 days after Adina made that phone call at 17,200 feet, Expedition Denali and the members of their team began to make their way up the slope to the summit ridge. They started off with incredible weather. It could not have been better. The sun was shining, the wind was clear, and as one person said, the weather it looks really good, and that's a little disconcerting. And as it happened, they were inundated by ice and snow. They were pummeled from all directions and had absolutely zero visibility, but they soldiered on. They continued on to the last named feature on the route, an area called the football field, which is the last named feature on the way to the summit. Though this picture doesn't show it very clearly, the summit is right there. They're 700 feet below the summit, and they're ready to go. But unfortunately, as they're packing and making their last pitch for the summit, there's a report of thunder. And with thunder comes lightning. Suddenly, the entire environment was charged with electricity. And they could actually hear the static charge of current going through their metal equipment. Every ice axe, every crampon, every piece of hardware that they had on them was actually throwing off sparks. They had to get out of there. So along with over 40 climbers that were also making an attempt to the summit, the team of Expedition Denali got their gear together and made a mad dash to the safety and security of their tents at 17,200 feet. Now, unfortunately, there was only 3 days left on their permit, so they weren't able to make a second attempt. And having failed in their attempt, they had to work their way back to their base camp at 14,200 feet and make their way home. But rather than dwelling on the obvious that they didn't make the summit, it's important to realize that the mountain decides who climbs and who doesn't. But it's up for us to try anyway, because by trying, we put ourselves there. We create an environment where we can ultimately share and bring back these incredible stories. So by turning tragedy into triumph, they came back safely, and every one of them is inspired to come back and climb again. And it's important to understand that they were able to go out and back to their communities and tell incredible stories of adventure. Expedition Denali was never about just making it to the summit. The primary goal of this expedition was to come back and to go and to tell the story. They've experienced audiences at churches, at historically black colleges, at elementary schools, and I'm happy to tell you this story today. We've demonstrated that people of color actually have a vital role to play in the preservation of wilderness through adventure. And as they come back to their communities, they can actually begin to seek out and enjoy careers in outdoor recreation and in conservation. And even though they may never have heard of Charlie Crenshaw, they may have never heard of the Buffalo Soldiers and the parks that they helped to create, this generation will come back and aspire to seek out new horizons that they may never have thought were possible before. And I hope that they'll do that in our national parks. And like Dr. King's dream, I hope that they will come back to their communities and share their stories with others so that they all might come back and we can all say in one loud, very proud voice from every mountainside, let freedom ring. Thank you.